When Mark Bellows first saw the house his grandfather had left him, it didn't feel like an inheritance. It felt like an echo from a life he had never lived. The two-story structure sat quietly at the far end of a narrow street most people in town had forgotten existed, surrounded by sagging fences, crooked mailboxes, and trees that had long outgrown the sidewalks. The place wasn't remarkable, not in the way a stranger might remember it, but for Mark, there was something about its stillness that seemed almost watchful. He had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather, Leonard Bellows, a man both admired and feared in the county, a sharp-tongued attorney who built his fortune on defending people nobody else would represent. Leonard's reputation had outlived him, whispered through the town's older residents like a half-remembered threat. To them, the Bellows name didn't just mean money or influence. It meant power, hidden behind polite smiles, the kind that didn't fade even after death. Mark wasn't like him. He owned a modest record store downtown, spent his evenings cataloging vinyl, and his mornings fixing old amplifiers. He didn't believe in legacy, only in the quiet comfort of routine. When the letter from the county arrived, informing him that the old Bellows property had officially been transferred to his name, he had considered selling it without a second thought. But something about the phrasing, with full rights to the original parcel and adjoining easements, made him hesitate. It was too formal, too deliberate. So, on a humid afternoon in June, he drove out to see it for himself, expecting nothing more than peeling paint and overgrown weeds. The first thing he noticed wasn't the house, but the fence. It stretched along the southern edge of the property, old cedar slats leaning toward the street at a strange angle. When he ran his hand along the wood, he realized that the base had been dug out and refilled with fresh soil, as if someone had recently moved it a few inches inward. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but the ground remembered. There were faint impressions of the original posts, a shallow trench now covered in grass. Someone had changed the line. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the gap between where the fence had been and where it stood now, and felt a chill that didn't belong to the weather. The neighbor's house loomed just beyond the corner, white siding, manicured roses, and a perfectly symmetrical porch. A woman stood on the steps, her hands clasped behind her back, watching him. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just tilted her head slightly as if measuring him. When he finally raised a hand in greeting, she turned and disappeared inside without a word. Later, he would learn her name was Karen Ellsworth, a longtime resident of the street, and, according to everyone he spoke with, the one who runs things around here. Inside, the house smelled like dust and varnish. His grandfather's office was exactly as described in the old stories, shelves heavy with law books, a desk positioned so that anyone sitting behind it could see both the window and the front gate. On the wall hung a framed county map dated 1964. The lines were drawn by hand, every parcel labeled with neat, deliberate penmanship. One thing caught his eye. The street outside the house was highlighted in faint pencil markings, connected to the Bellows property with a note in the margin. Retained in full. It didn't make sense at first. Streets weren't private. They belonged to the city. Yet here, on this brittle document, was a claim that said otherwise. That night, Mark sat in the empty living room with the lights off, staring through the window at the crooked fence. He could hear faint music from somewhere down the block, the rhythmic hum of sprinklers, the muffled laughter of neighbors who didn't know he existed until that day. The world beyond the fence moved on as if nothing had changed, but he could feel something stirring beneath the surface, the unease of a secret that had waited decades to be found. He told himself it was just a fence, just old paperwork, nothing more. But as he lay awake later, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house, and the street itself, had been waiting for him to return, not as a visitor, but as the next Bellows to finish what the last one had started. 2 mornings after his first visit, Mark returned to the house with a toolbox and a plan to reset the fence back to its proper place. It was early, the air still cool enough to carry the smell of wet soil, and the street was silent except for the faint rumble of a delivery truck somewhere in the distance. The wood was lighter than he expected, dry and brittle at the base, and as he began to dig out the misaligned posts, he couldn't shake the image of someone deliberately moving them in the night. There was a pattern to the way they had been shifted. Each section turned slightly inward, stealing small, almost invisible strips of land. It wasn't vandalism. It was calculation. When he finally finished replanting the posts along the faint trench he had discovered days earlier, the fence aligned perfectly with the boundary shown on his grandfather's map. It felt right, balanced, as if something had quietly clicked back into place. He stood there satisfied, brushing dirt from his hands, unaware that the act would unravel an entire neighborhood's illusion of normalcy. That afternoon, a knock echoed through the hallway of the old house. Mark opened the door to find the same woman from the porch, Karen Ellsworth, standing on his steps with a folder clutched tightly to her chest. Her expression carried that particular kind of politeness reserved for confrontation. She introduced herself with a voice that was soft but trained, the voice of someone who'd spent years managing committees and winning arguments over dinner tables. She congratulated him on inheriting the property, and then, almost seamlessly, accused him of disturbing shared boundaries. When he asked what she meant, she opened the folder and produced a printed survey that she claimed had been verified by the homeowners committee, showing that his fence now crossed onto her property by nearly a foot. Her tone was not aggressive but firm, rehearsed, like she was repeating lines she'd used before. Mark tried to explain that he had only restored the fence to where it had been for decades, that the county's own maps backed his claim, but she smiled tightly and said she would be taking this matter to the appropriate channels. She didn't wait for a response, just turned, heels clicking against the pavement, and left him standing in the doorway with a growing sense of disbelief. 3 days later, the disbelief turned to dread when a thick envelope arrived from the county clerk's office. Inside was a notice of civil complaint, Karen Ellsworth vs. Mark Bellows, alleging unlawful modification of property boundaries, trespassing, and damage to private landscaping. The complaint was absurd, almost laughable, yet each page carried the county's seal, every word printed in the sterile precision of bureaucracy. He read it twice, then a third time, his stomach tightening with each paragraph. She wasn't bluffing. She was suing him over a fence post. He thought about calling a lawyer, but the absurdity of it all made him hesitate. Who needed legal counsel for a neighbor's tantrum? Still, something about the paperwork unsettled him. The way it referenced not just her address, but the entirety of Maple Hollow Street, as if the land itself were under dispute. He decided to visit the county office the next morning. The records building was cold and windowless, a maze of corridors that smelled faintly of toner and old paper. The clerk, a thin man with rimless glasses and a polite impatience, took his request without looking up. "Property records for 47 Maple Hollow," Mark said, sliding his ID across the counter. The man typed, frowned, then adjusted his glasses and typed again. "That's interesting," he murmured. "You're not listed under a numbered lot. You're under a legacy parcel." Mark leaned closer. "What does that mean?" The clerk hesitated. "It means this street wasn't originally divided when the city incorporated. It remained private land. The owner of record was—" He stopped, then looked up at Mark with a trace of confusion. "Leonard Bellows, the same name as yours." Mark nodded slowly. "That was my grandfather." The clerk tapped the screen again. "Well, according to the deed, he never subdivided the street. He retained ownership of the entire block, including the road, drainage lines, and adjacent easements. It's still under his estate." Mark blinked, certain he'd misheard. "You're saying this entire street belongs to me?" The clerk shrugged. "Technically, yes. There's been no transfer of title since the 60s. The houses here were built under conditional access agreements, but none were formally recorded. Which means, legally speaking, everyone living on that street is sitting on your grandfather's property." For a long moment, Mark couldn't speak. The information was so far removed from the petty argument about a fence that it didn't feel real. When he finally left the office, clutching a printed copy of the deed and the survey map, his mind was spinning. What began as a neighborhood misunderstanding had turned into something else entirely, something inherited, buried beneath decades of oversight and silence. He spent the evening going over the documents at the old desk in the study. The handwriting on the original deed was unmistakably his grandfather's, meticulous looping strokes that carried authority even across time. There was a section, almost hidden in the legal jargon, stating, "Ownership of adjoining street to remain private under Bellows estate until revoked in writing by heir." The line sent a chill through him. He was the heir, and he had just exercised control over that land without realizing it. By resetting the fence, he had unknowingly reasserted a dormant claim, one that now challenged the legitimacy of every house on that street. At dusk, he stepped outside to clear his head. Karen's porch light was on. Through the sheer curtains, he could see her silhouette moving back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear. Across the road, another neighbor watched from a window, then quickly drew the blinds. The air felt different now, thicker, expectant. The quiet suburban charm had taken on a nervous rhythm, every movement behind the curtains carrying a question. What did he know, and what was he planning to do with it? As he stood there, the faint sound of tires rolled up the street, and a black sedan slowed near his driveway before continuing on, its headlights sweeping over the fence he had just restored. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw someone in the passenger seat watching him through the window, and then the car was gone. The street returned to silence, but the stillness no longer felt peaceful. It felt like the pause between accusation and consequence, the moment when a secret realizes it's been seen. He went back inside and locked the door, his pulse steady but his thoughts unraveling. He knew now that the lawsuit was not about a fence. It was about ownership, about history, about control. Karen hadn't just picked the wrong argument. She had picked the wrong name to provoke. For the next week, the air on Maple Hollow Street carried an invisible charge, the kind of tension that made every casual glance feel like surveillance. Mark tried to ignore it, keeping himself busy with repairs around the old house, yet the weight of the documents he'd uncovered seemed to follow him everywhere, pressing down like a secret too large to hold. He hadn't told anyone what the clerk had revealed. Not Karen, not the neighbors, not even the lawyer he'd considered consulting. Some part of him didn't quite believe it himself, but another quieter part whispered that the street already knew. The shift in how people looked at him confirmed it. A woman who used to wave from her porch now crossed to the other side of the road when he walked by. The mail carrier avoided eye contact, and one afternoon, Mark found his garbage bins overturned with a faint chemical smell rising from the puddle beneath them. It wasn't vandalism. It was a message, a reminder that the neighborhood was closing ranks. He decided to take the diplomatic route. One evening, he knocked on Karen's door, carrying a printed copy of the old survey and the county record. She opened the door halfway, wearing a cardigan the color of dried roses and that same expression of curated civility. The smell of candle wax and something floral drifted out. He explained calmly that there might have been a misunderstanding about the property lines, that the street itself seemed to belong to his grandfather's estate, and therefore technically to him. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes flickered for a brief second, sharp and calculating. Then she laughed, not with amusement, but with a brittle disbelief that sounded rehearsed. "That's impossible," she said, the words brittle as glass. "This is a public street. Everyone knows that." He offered to show her the documents, but she refused, waving a hand dismissively as though shooing away a persistent salesman. "If you're planning to use this fantasy in court, I'd advise against it. Judges don't appreciate people wasting their time with family myths." She closed the door gently, but the deadbolt slid into place with a metallic finality that left him staring at the painted wood for a long moment before walking away. The following morning, flyers appeared on every doorstep. They were neatly printed, unsigned, but the language was unmistakably hers. Be aware of unauthorized property claims in our community. Certain individuals are attempting to manipulate outdated documents for personal gain. Stay alert and protect your homes. Mark read it twice, feeling the words burn under his skin. Certain individuals. The phrasing was careful, legalistic, but everyone would know who she meant. When he stepped outside that afternoon, the difference was visible. Conversations stopped when he passed. Blinds shifted. Doors closed just a little faster than usual. He had become an intruder in a place that, by law, belonged to him. That night he couldn't sleep. The house creaked and groaned as if settling deeper into its own secrets. Around midnight, he stepped out onto the porch, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked asphalt. A faint glow pulsed from the end of the street, someone's flashlight moving slowly, deliberately, along the fence line. He froze, watching the light trace the wood where he had reset the posts. It lingered, paused, then vanished. Moments later, a car door shut softly, and an engine rolled away. When he walked down the next morning, muddy footprints marked the edge of his lawn, leading right up to the fence and back toward the street. They were small, deliberate, and matched the shape of a woman's boots. Trying to steady himself, Mark returned to the county office, hoping for clarity. The same clerk looked uneasy when he saw him. "Mr. Bellows," he said quietly, "I shouldn't be telling you this, but we've had multiple information requests about your parcel in the last 48 hours. Mark frowned. "From who?" The clerk adjusted his glasses. "Private citizens, 2 real estate attorneys, and someone from the Homeowners Association. They're trying to verify your claim. Word's gotten around." He hesitated before adding, "One of the requests came with a letter of intent to challenge your title. It's not official yet, but it's moving fast." Mark thanked him, though the words felt hollow, and walked out into the parking lot with the sense that the ground beneath him was beginning to tilt. The escalation wasn't loud or violent. It was quieter than that, more insidious. He began finding small things out of place around the property. The mailbox hinge unscrewed, the side gate unlatched, the water meter tampered with, so the reading spiked overnight. Each incident was minor enough to dismiss, but together they painted a picture of deliberate harassment. Karen's car, a beige sedan that matched her personality too perfectly, began parking directly across from his driveway, always facing his house, its windshield reflecting sunlight like a silent accusation. One evening, as he was locking up the record store, he noticed her sitting in it, engine off, just staring through the glass. When he approached, she rolled down the window 2 inches and said, in a voice perfectly even, "You're making a mistake, Mark. You can't own what everyone uses. People don't like being reminded that their comfort depends on someone else's signature." Then she drove off before he could answer. It was then he realized the lawsuit was no longer about property or boundaries. It had become personal. Karen wasn't defending her lawn or her pride. She was defending the illusion that everything around her was stable and rightful. To admit otherwise would mean acknowledging that the foundation of her world, of everyone's world on that street, was built on borrowed ground. And she wasn't the only one clinging to that illusion. 2 of the neighbors stopped by under the pretense of checking in, their words polite but probing. They asked if he planned to develop the land or change access rights, each question loaded with anxiety disguised as curiosity. He gave them vague reassurances, but their smiles were tight, and when they left, he saw them whispering to Karen across the street. That evening, Mark sat in his grandfather's old chair, staring at the wall map again. The street, the lots, the faint pencil marks, they all looked harmless enough, lines on paper, yet they carried the weight of ownership, control, and resentment passed down through decades. He tried to picture his grandfather here, pen in hand, drawing those borders with the same quiet confidence Karen now displayed in her defiance. Perhaps Leonard Bellows had known this would happen one day, had even planned for it. Perhaps that's why he never sold the street or transferred the title. Not because of negligence, but because he understood what boundaries really meant. Not fences or deeds, but power. And now that power had resurfaced, alive in his grandson's hands, setting off ripples through a neighborhood built on convenience and denial. When he finally rose to close the curtains, he caught sight of Karen's porch again. She stood there with her phone pressed to her ear, her silhouette framed in yellow light. Behind her, several neighbors had gathered in the shadows, their voices low, conspiratorial. The sight sent a cold tremor down his spine. He turned off the lamp and let the darkness swallow the room, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the fence was no longer a line between yards. It was the front in a quiet war that had already begun. By the second month, Mark had learned to recognize the rhythms of hostility. The neighborhood didn't confront him directly anymore. It simply withdrew. The silence had its own pattern. A car that slowed too long outside his house, a neighbor who smiled but didn't wave, the faint scrape of mail being slipped through his slot late at night instead of at noon, when it was supposed to arrive. It was as if the entire street had agreed to act as one living organism, coordinated through glances and whispers, its pulse beating beneath the polished calm of suburbia. Every time he tried to reach out, something invisible pulled back. Even the air felt altered, thicker somehow, carrying the weight of conversations that ended the moment he appeared. He stopped opening the curtains in the morning, because he could feel the stares before he saw them. One evening, driven by frustration and a strange, creeping curiosity, Mark returned to the county archives with the intention of uncovering everything his grandfather had left behind. The records department occupied a neglected annex of the courthouse, a place that smelled of mildew and old glue, its walls lined with steel drawers labeled in fading ink. The clerk on duty was a young woman who seemed both overworked and underpaid, and when he explained that he was researching legacy parcels under the Bellows estate, she gave a small, knowing smile that immediately made him uneasy. "You're not the first to ask," she said quietly, flipping through a ledger. "Someone came in last week. Woman, mid-50s, short blonde hair, said she was part of the Neighborhood Preservation Board." He didn't need to ask who it was. Karen had been here too. The woman led him to a storage room where the older records were kept. Massive bound books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. She warned him not to remove the documents from the room, then left him alone under the flickering yellow light. It took him an hour to find the one he was looking for. Maple Hollow Development Proposal, 1958. Inside were maps, letters, and permit drafts, all written before the street had been paved. What caught his attention wasn't the paperwork itself, but a folded piece of tracing paper tucked inside, covered in his grandfather's handwriting. The notes described a temporary settlement authorization that allowed builders to construct homes on Bellows-owned land until city and corporation could finalize jurisdiction. The agreement was supposed to be renewed every 25 years, but the last renewal had been in 1989. After that, nothing. The authorization had quietly expired more than 30 years ago. That realization hit him harder than he expected. It meant that none of the current homeowners had legal standing to occupy their properties. The entire street existed in a kind of bureaucratic limbo, where every mortgage, every deed, every property line was a ghost, held together by habit and collective ignorance. He read the note again, tracing his grandfather's precise penmanship. At the bottom of the page, a single line was underlined twice. Retain possession until successor demonstrates understanding of the boundary's meaning. It wasn't legal language. It was personal, almost philosophical. But what did it mean? Understanding of the boundary's meaning. It felt less like an instruction and more like a warning. Mark left the archives with a copy of the record, his mind unraveling with possibilities. Maybe Leonard Bellows had never trusted the city's handling of the development. Maybe he wanted to keep leverage, a way to control what happened long after he was gone. Or maybe he had simply understood that the street, like every community built on borrowed land, would eventually turn against its own foundation, Whatever his motives had been, they now lived in Mark's hands, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather had somehow orchestrated this moment, even from the grave. That night, he decided to visit the one person in the neighborhood who hadn't openly sided with Karen, Dale Myers, the quiet man who lived in the weathered house at the far corner of the street. Dale was older, maybe in his 60s, with the kind of stooped posture that spoke of years spent doing work that never got appreciated. When Mark knocked, the door opened almost immediately, as if the man had been expecting him. Dale listened silently as Mark explained what he'd found, his lined face unreadable. When Mark showed him the photocopy of the 1958 document, the old man's eyes flickered with something that looked dangerously close to recognition. "I remember your grandfather," Dale said finally, his voice low and cautious. "He used to come by every few months, checking the fences, measuring things. People thought he was just being particular, but I knew better. He wasn't protecting his land. He was watching the people living on it." The words settled like a stone in Mark's stomach. "What was he watching for?" Dale sighed, running a hand over his jaw. "Abandonment, mostly. He said a place stops belonging to its owner the moment the people who live there forget who they owe it to. And let me tell you, most folks here forgot a long time ago." He looked at Mark with something close to pity. "You think this is about money or property lines, but it's not. It's about control. This street's been pretending to be free for decades. You just reminded them they're not." When Mark left Dale's house, the sky was heavy with clouds, the air tasting faintly of ozone. He could feel the neighborhood breathing around him, its lights glowing like watchful eyes. Somewhere behind him, a door shut sharply. He turned and saw Karen standing on her porch again, this time without the mask of politeness. Her gaze followed him all the way down the street, unwavering, as if she knew exactly what he had discovered. Back inside, Mark poured himself a glass of water and sat in the dark, replaying Dale's words. The idea of control pulsed through his thoughts. It wasn't just about who owned what. It was about who dictated the illusion of ownership. His grandfather had left him something far more dangerous than a house. He had left him leverage, and now every resident on that street was trapped under the weight of it. He could, if he wanted, enforce the expiration of the old agreements, which would effectively turn every house into illegal construction. The power of that possibility both unsettled and tempted him. It was a strange feeling, the kind of moral vertigo that comes from realizing you hold someone else's fate in your hands. The next morning, he received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page from a law firm's letterhead, unsigned but unmistakably threatening. It accused him of willful manipulation of legacy records and warned that continued interference with the homeowner's rights could result in collective legal action. There was no signature, no contact information, just the phrase, "Consider what you've inherited." He looked at the words until they blurred, then crumpled the letter and dropped it in the wastebasket. For the first time, he felt the faint edge of fear. It wasn't just Karen now. Someone else was watching the street. Someone who knew more about the Bellows legacy than he did. That night, he dreamed of the map, the lines shifting and fading as if erased by unseen hands, the street disappearing beneath the paper's surface. When he woke, his pulse was pounding, and the sound of rain drummed against the roof like fingers tapping out a warning. He walked to the window and saw Karen's car parked across the street again, headlights off, windows fogged. But this time, she wasn't alone. There was another figure in the passenger seat, turned slightly toward his house, their face obscured by darkness. They sat there for nearly an hour before driving away, the tires leaving a slick trail through the rain that glistened under the dim streetlight. Mark didn't sleep after that. He sat in his grandfather's chair, the old deed spread before him, the lamp casting a pale circle of light over the words, "Retained in full." By dawn, he understood something that made his stomach turn. The lawsuit, the harassment, the whispers. None of it was about winning or losing. It was about forcing him to act, to reveal whether he would honor the boundary his grandfather had drawn or try to erase it. The entire street had become a test, and somewhere in the dark, someone was waiting to see which side of the line he would stand on. The street answered his silence with movement that looked innocuous at first, a slow rearranging of routines that only made sense when viewed from the window of the old house at odd hours when most people believed they were invisible. And Mark learned to read those small migrations the way one reads weather on the horizon, understanding that the change never arrives as a single storm, but as a chain of pressures that tighten until the air itself feels thinner. A week after the unsigned letter, someone painted a pale gray line down the center of Maple Hollow, neat as a surgeon's stitch, beginning 3 houses past his gate and ending just before his driveway, which meant any car pulling in would cross that new spine as if breaching a boundary that the city had never recognized. And the paint was so faint you might miss it in daylight. Yet at dusk, it glowed like a rule whispered in a child's ear. That same evening, low plastic cones appeared at the far end of the block with laminated cards that read, "Resident Access," the kind of phrase that promises nothing and implies everything. And though there was no authority behind the words, the effect was immediate. Delivery vans hesitated, ride shares turned around, and the street began to contract, as if it were bracing against him. 2 days later, the garbage truck rolled past his cans without stopping, and when he called the service desk, a weary voice told him his address was no longer recognized on the route database because the lane had been reclassified, a term that sat between a mistake and a threat. And while the representative promised to investigate, the promise dissolved into the hold music that droned until the line died. The next morning, a pallet of unassembled metal boxes stood on the verge outside Karen's house, and by afternoon, a small crew had bolted them into a tidy cluster of mail slots, stamped with numbers that skipped his entirely, leaving a gap like a pulled tooth where his correspondence should have been. By sunset, the neighbors were smiling at the convenience of it, and Mark understood the kind of ingenuity that thrives in polite suburbs. If you can't erase a person, you erase the pathways that connect to him, and sooner or later, the world forgets how to reach his door. He went back to the county building with the map folded tight in his pocket and asked to speak to someone higher than a clerk, not to argue, but to ask a practical question about access and maintenance obligations, now that the old authorizations had lapsed, and the official who finally received him did so, with the immaculate calm of a man who had learned to carry his caution on the inside of his suit jacket. The conversation never touched the word ownership. It circled easements and continuity of use, and the city's aversion to historic entanglements. And when Mark mentioned the expired renewals, the official steepled his fingers and said that while the county recognized the documents, it had no appetite for disrupting established occupancy, which translated to a principle as old as any law. If enough people pretend something is true for long enough, government will declare it truth to keep the peace. On his way out, a receptionist slid an envelope across the counter, addressed in careful type to Successor Bellows, and inside he found a proposal drafted by a mediation group offering to facilitate a neighbor access covenant, whereby he would acknowledge the street as shared in perpetuity in exchange for a token stipend and a mutual non-disparagement clause, and the fact that the figure was comically small told him the stipend was not a payment, but a lesson, the kind a classroom gives to the child who refuses to share his crayons. That night the sound returned, not the furtive scraping he had heard in earlier weeks, but the thud of something heavy being dropped onto asphalt, followed by the soft rhythm of a ratchet and the whisper of rubber on metal. And when he stepped onto the porch, he saw 4 low rectangles set at even intervals along the painted line, the sort of modular speed cushions that cities deploy with press releases and ribbon cuttings, except these carried no markings, no reflective paint, no signage beyond a stack of homemade notices taped to a lamppost declaring, "Traffic Calming Pilot, Neighborhood Initiative." And he stood there with his hands on the rail as 2 men in work gloves tightened the last bolts, their expressions blank with the concentration of people who have convinced themselves they are doing something good and therefore do not need permission. In the morning, his front steps rattled with the slow parade of cars crawling over the new bumps, and the first time he drove toward his driveway, The neighbor 3 doors down flashed his lights and lifted a palm in a stiff gesture that was neither greeting nor warning, and Mark felt a brief flare of something childish and unhelpful, and therefore honest. The urge to floor the accelerator and obliterate the installations just to hear the bolts rip free. He didn't. He parked, went inside, and found 3 envelopes tucked under the door, each a different species of pressure masquerading as correspondence. The mortgage servicer for the house he rented out across town advised that his policy required confirmation of clear ingress and egress to any property he owned, and failure to certify uninterrupted access on Maple Hollow could trigger a review of his entire portfolio. A title company he had never contacted informed him that it would no longer insure transfers involving parcels within the legacy tract until the successor clarified intent regarding dedication, and the homeowners committee, on letterhead that still smelled of a home printer, invited him to attend a listening session where residents would describe how his recent behavior had affected their sense of safety, a phrase so carefully engineered it left him breathless with its cruelty. He poured a glass of water he did not want and stood over the sink until the tap ran cold enough to numb his fingers, and only then did the anger steady into something usable, not the theatrical fury the street expected, but a patient refusal to be shepherded toward the compromise they had prepared. He began to answer in the one language the map understood. Without announcements or porch speeches, he hired a crew, not men with trucks and stenciled logos, but a father and daughter who ran a small paving company out of a yard behind their house, and asked them to mark the edges of the original private right-of-way, according to the deed, which meant stringing bright, taut lines along the places where sod had crept over asphalt and flower beds had swallowed corners that did not belong to them. And while the crew worked, he walked the perimeter with the folded tracing paper in his pocket, touching the knots as if they were prayer beads, telling himself not that he was reclaiming, but that he was remembering. The first morning the neighborhood watched from windows. By noon someone called to complain. By late afternoon, Karen stood at the edge of her lawn with her arms crossed, speaking softly to a man who measured the lines with a tape. And though Mark could not hear the words, he could read the shape of them. This is outrageous. This is harassment. This is not who we are. When the daughter snapped chalk along the final span, a soft crack against the warmed pavement, it felt to Mark like the answer to a question he had tried not to ask, whether a boundary is real when no one believes in it. It is, the line said, if you can see it in daylight and still stand there after sunset. The retaliation came in ways that would never make a headline because they weren't crimes, only calculations. A sedan idled at the corner every evening until the street grew sleepy, then rolled away, and when he traced the license plate, the registry returned a leasing pool assigned to a property management firm that specialized in neighborhood stabilization, a phrase he had heard once in a lecture about benign language for coercive projects, and he stood in the hall with the receiver pressed to his ear, while a receptionist told him cheerfully that she could not disclose client lists without a court order. The next day a petition appeared online, full of soft words about preserving community and preventing nuisance claims arising from historical paperwork, and the comments gathered like iron filings around the magnet of a single idea, that Mark was the hazard because he insisted on the truth of a line everyone else had trained themselves not to see. He tried to tell himself that none of it mattered, that the deed did not gain or lose force by being popular, yet his body betrayed him, waking in the thin hours with the image of the speed cushions and the cones and the gray stripe all threaded together into a net that would tighten each time he hesitated. On a windless afternoon, he found Karen waiting at the boundary string near the hydrangeas. She tended like a second profession, and she asked, without pleasantries, whether he understood what would happen if he pushed any further. Not to her, she said, because she would cope as she always had, but to the families who had saved for years to live on a street where children could ride bicycles and neighbors borrowed sugar, and people believed their homes sat on foundations, not favors. Her voice did not tremble, and she did not ask for mercy. She asked for collusion, wrapped in the moral vocabulary of community, and for the first time he saw not malice, but a terror so intimate it looked like composure. He answered carefully that the line predated both of them, and that neither fear nor kindness could move it. and she smiled in a way that pretended to concede while promising escalation, then stepped back across the string with the posture of someone who has practiced losing ground without admitting it. That night, a letter arrived from a law firm with a single sentence that did not threaten or plead. Our clients are prepared to adopt the street if you dedicate it. The choice to become necessary or to remain an obstacle is yours. And he sat with the sentence until the room went dark and understood that the second escalation was not about force at all, but about endurance, about how long he could hold still while the neighborhood rehearsed life around him, as if he had already surrendered. The morning of the hearing arrived without warning, as if the calendar had advanced overnight while he was asleep, and when Mark stepped out of the house, the street was hushed in that peculiar way that suggests both expectation and exhaustion, a silence thick enough to muffle his footsteps. The air was heavy with early spring dampness, and the asphalt still bore the chalk residue from the lines he had ordered drawn weeks ago, faint white veins leading toward the courthouse of the small county seat, where everything that mattered would be reduced to paragraphs and signatures. He had told himself that it was only a procedural review, a chance for the city to determine whether Maple Hollow qualified for public adoption, but he knew what was really at stake. Not the street itself, but the illusion of normal life for everyone who lived on it, and the measure of how far he was willing to go to defend a legacy he never asked to inherit. The hearing room was utilitarian, too small for the number of spectators who had come. Folding chairs scraped the tile, voices whispered in rehearsed outrage, and when he entered, a ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, a kind of collective intake of breath that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with containment. Karen sat in the front row beside a lawyer in a navy suit who carried himself with the polite arrogance of someone certain of victory. She didn't look at Mark, not directly. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the county commissioner, who presided from behind a laminate dais that looked more like a counter in a small-town bank. The commissioner spoke in the flat, procedural rhythm of bureaucracy, reciting case numbers and agenda items, and when he finally said Bellows versus residents of Maple Hollow, the room's collective exhale sounded almost like relief. Mark stood when called, his documents bound neatly in a folder, the map folded and refolded until the paper had gone soft at the creases. The lawyer representing the residents rose first, outlining the argument that the street had functioned as a public right-of-way for decades, that the principle of continuous public use superseded any dormant claim, and that to enforce the original deed would cause irreparable harm to innocent homeowners. It was an elegant speech, designed to appeal to sentiment rather than statute, and when he finished, several heads nodded in the audience, as though the decision were already made. Mark waited until the commissioner gestured to him, then stepped forward. He did not read from his notes. Instead, he unfolded the map on the table and pointed to the handwritten clause, the one in his grandfather's script, retained in full. He spoke quietly, evenly, explaining how the authorization had lapsed, how every house stood on technically unpermitted ground, how the law had not been rewritten just because time had blurred it. He said he didn't wish to evict anyone or upend their lives, but that truth could not be erased by comfort, and that property, like history, only stayed silent until someone listened. His words did not carry the fervor of righteousness. They carried the steadiness of fatigue. When he looked up, the commissioner's expression was unreadable, caught between practicality and principle. Karen's lawyer rose again, this time abandoning the legal pretense for something closer to moral indictment. He painted Mark as an opportunist, a man resurrecting old paperwork to exercise power, a threat to the sanctity of home. The room tightened around the rhetoric, and Mark could feel the shift, the familiar warmth of public sympathy gravitating toward the side that promised safety rather than accuracy. Karen herself finally spoke, her voice trembling not with fear, but with practiced sincerity. She said she respected the Bellows legacy, that she too valued history, but that progress required forgiveness of the past, and that holding on to outdated claims was like keeping a gate locked in a neighborhood where children needed to play freely. The line drew applause, subdued but real, and for a moment, Mark almost believed the narrative they had woven for him, that he was the obstacle, the anomaly in an otherwise peaceful place. The commissioner called for a recess. Outside, the afternoon light had dulled to a pewter gray, and a fine rain misted across the steps. Mark leaned against the railing, feeling the paper soften in his hands, and realized that the choice before him was not whether to win, but what winning would mean. If he held the line, the court would have to acknowledge his rights, forcing the city either to compensate him or to seize the land through eminent domain, a process that would drag for years and destroy whatever community remained. If he conceded, the Bellows estate would dissolve quietly into history, one more forgotten technicality. He thought of his grandfather's note about understanding the boundary's meaning and realized that perhaps it was never about possession, but about clarity, about knowing when a line stops protecting and starts imprisoning. When the session resumed, Mark requested to speak once more. His voice was calm, stripped of the tension that had haunted him for weeks. He said he would not contest the residents' continued use of the street, that he recognized the city's right to adopt it as public, but that he wanted one condition entered into record, that the original Bellows boundary be preserved in documentation as a matter of historical record, a reminder that every community stands on choices made by people long gone. The commissioner, visibly relieved, nodded, and the lawyer murmured agreement. Karen looked at him then, finally, her expression flickering between triumph and unease, as if she sensed that his concession was not defeat, but extraction, a quiet removal of himself from the game she had spent months perfecting. The gavel struck once, the sound hollow but final. The crowd dispersed into murmurs and damp coats. Mark remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty table, at the faint outline of the map beneath the fluorescent light. The storm outside had deepened, and as he walked through the parking lot, the rain fell harder, washing the chalk from his shoes, from the paper, from everything that had tried to draw permanence from dust. By the time he reached the car, he knew the outcome would travel faster than he could. Karen would celebrate, the neighbors would exhale, the city would file its new ordinance, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that the line still existed somewhere under the asphalt, invisible yet real, the memory of it preserved not on maps or deeds, but in the brief moment when he stood before them all and refused to lie about what was true. Weeks passed before the street forgot how to look at him. The cones disappeared first, then the notices, then the awkward pauses when he walked by, until Maple Hollow settled back into its practiced rhythm of trimmed lawns and distant politeness. The city's new sign stood at the corner, Public Access Road, black letters on clean aluminum, and beneath it the pavement gleamed with fresh asphalt, the faintest trace of white chalk still visible where the old boundary had once run. Karen organized a small gathering to celebrate resolution, stringing paper lanterns between mailboxes and offering lemonade to anyone who lingered long enough to prove their loyalty to normalcy. Mark watched from his porch, unseen, listening to the laughter that carried through the dusk like a rehearsal for forgetting. It struck him that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the collective decision to pretend it had never existed. Inside the house, the silence felt different now, neither oppressive nor comforting, only exact. He had left the study untouched since the hearing, the map still spread across the desk, its paper stiff with dried watermarks. He sat before it and traced the faded pencil lines with the edge of his thumb, realizing that his grandfather had probably done the same gesture half a century ago, feeling the same weight that came from understanding too much about the fragility of ownership. The line meant nothing now in law, yet it still carried a presence, a faint pulse like the echo of something buried, but not dead. He thought of how Karen had looked that final moment in court, relieved yet shaken, and wondered if she ever felt the quiet humiliation of being spared by someone she had tried to ruin. When summer arrived, the county sent him a formal letter of gratitude for his cooperation in achieving civic harmony. It was written in the same tone used for parking permits and tree removal approvals, polite to the point of erasure. He folded it neatly and placed it beside the deed in a drawer he locked without reason, Outside, the street shimmered under heat, the new asphalt releasing that metallic scent that rises from the ground after rain. Children rode bicycles down the middle of the road where his grandfather's signature once claimed dominion, and he watched them without bitterness, only with the detached understanding that some inheritances are meant to be surrendered. As dusk fell, he walked to the corner where the new sign stood and touched its smooth surface. Beneath his hand, the metal was warm, and for a moment he imagined the old fence still running there, invisible but faithful, marking not division or control, but memory. The wind rose softly, stirring the leaves, and he turned back toward the house that waited with its unchanging silence, aware that the story had not ended, only folded itself neatly into the history of the street, like a scar healed but never forgotten.